A wall of wind slammed snow sideways across the highway. A man went down hard against the frame of a dead motorcycle. His gloves were frozen stiff. His fingers wouldn't close. He tried to lift himself and slid right back down into the drift. A truck roared past, then another, and another. None of them slowed, none of them even tapped the brakes. Snow packed into his collar. His lips had already gone blue. Beside him, a scrappy little stray dog pressed against his ribs and would not move. This was Duke Hargrove, 68 years old, a man who had survived a war and 40 years of open road. And now he was freezing to death 200 feet from a warm diner while the whole world drove by. Who would finally stop for a broken-down old biker in the middle of a blizzard? Stay with me on this one. Let me back this up about an hour, because you need to understand how a man like Duke ends up dying in a ditch on Highway 12. He'd left Spokane that morning before the sun came up. The forecast said heavy snow by evening. Duke figured he'd beat it. He'd been beating weather his whole life. 68 years old, and he still rode a 1998 Harley he'd rebuilt twice with his own two hands. That bike knew him better than most people did. And that morning it started on the first kick, the way it always had. Now here's the thing about Duke. He wasn't running from anything. He was riding towards something. In the saddlebag, wrapped in an old flannel shirt, was a folded flag and a name written on a piece of paper. He'd carried that paper for 40 years without ever using it. He was going to Montana to keep a promise he'd made to a dead man. That's all he'd tell you if you asked. He wasn't a talker. His hands were the problem. Duke's fingers had been half ruined a long time ago, back in a place he didn't like to name. Frostbite, then worse, then surgery that never quite took. On a warm day, they worked fine. On a cold day, they stiffened up like old leather. And this was not a warm day. The snow came early. It came fast. By the time Duke crossed the county line outside Bozeman, the whole sky had turned the color of wet concrete, and the road was gone under a white sheet. He should have pulled off. He knew it. But there was no place to pull off, just fence line and open field for miles, so he kept going, slow and careful, both hands cramping around the grips. Then the engine coughed. Once, twice, and died just like that. 40 years of loyalty, and the old bike quit on him in the worst possible spot. Water in the line, maybe, frozen fuel, didn't matter. Duke coasted to the shoulder, and the silence that came after was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. He tried to restart it. His hands wouldn't grip the throttle right. He tried again. Nothing. He climbed off to check the tank, and that's when his boots went out from under him on the ice, and he came down hard against the frame. That's where the story really starts. Right there. A man on the ground in the cold moving in. Now Duke wasn't alone. About 3 hours back, at a gas station outside Missoula, a dog had come slinking around the pumps. Half coyote by the look of him, ribs showing, one ear chewed up. Everybody shooed him off. Duke bought a gas station hot dog and knelt down and fed it to him piece by piece. Didn't say much, just fed him. And when Duke pulled out, the dog followed the bike for half a mile before Duke stopped and let him climb up into the saddlebag with his head sticking out. He'd named him Ranger. Because Rangers lead the way, Duke said, and this one clearly had nowhere else to be. So now it was the two of them down in the snow. And Duke did the math the way an old soldier does. He knew what the cold could do. He knew how fast it took the fingers, then the mind, then everything. He knew he had maybe 40 minutes of clear thinking left, and after that he'd start feeling warm and sleepy, and that warm feeling would be the last mistake he ever made. He got himself propped against the bike. He waved at the first truck. His arm barely came up. The truck blew past in a cloud of white. He waved at the second. A big rig driver had to have seen him, went right on by. The third slowed. Duke's heart lifted. Then the driver got a good look at the leather, the gray beard, the tattoos on the back of those ruined hands, and hit the gas. You could see it happen. The man decided Duke was trouble, decided an old biker in the snow was somebody else's problem. and he drove on. That's the part that gets me, because Duke wasn't trouble. Duke had spent his whole life being the man other people leaned on. But out there on the shoulder, all anybody saw was a rough old stranger they didn't want to touch. Ranger started to whine. He pressed in tight against Duke's chest, shivering, trying to give him what little warmth a starving dog has to give. Duke got one arm around him. "Easy," he said. His voice came out cracked. "Easy, boy, somebody'll stop." But the trucks kept coming, and the trucks kept going, and the snow kept falling. And Duke's eyes started to get heavy, and that warm feeling he'd been dreading began to creep up from somewhere deep inside, whispering that it was okay to close them just for a minute. He was so close to gone. And then way down the highway through the white came a pair of dim yellow headlights moving slow. The truck that finally stopped was a rusted-out Ford pickup, older than the dog and twice as beat up. It didn't roar. It didn't hurry. It just eased down onto the shoulder, tires crunching, and rolled to a stop maybe 10 feet from where Duke lay. For a second nothing happened. Duke figured they were getting a look at him, same as the last one, and any moment now they'd pull back onto the road and leave him. Then the driver's door opened, and out stepped the smallest person Duke had ever seen behind the wheel of a truck. She couldn't have been 5 feet tall. She was wrapped in a man's canvas coat 3 sizes too big, with a wool scarf over her white hair and rubber boots up to her knees. Her face was a road map of 80-some years, deep lines around the eyes, cheeks red from the cold. And she came right at him, pushing through snow up to her shins, not one bit of hesitation in her. "Well, don't just lay there," she said. "You'll catch your death." Duke actually laughed. It came out as a croak, catch his death. He was about 90 seconds from it. "Ma'am," he managed, "you shouldn't be out in this. Road's no good." "You keep going." She stopped over him and put her fists on her hips and looked down at him like a schoolteacher who'd caught a boy lying. "Don't you tell me what I shouldn't do," she said. "I've been driving this road since before your daddy was born. Now can you stand up or can't you?" "My hands," Duke said. "They won't work and I got a dog." She looked at Ranger. Ranger looked at her. And that scrappy, half-wild stray who'd bitten 2 men at the gas station that very morning wagged his tail. "Course you got a dog," she said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "He rides in the cab, come on." Now you have to understand what she was up against. Duke was a big man, 6'2", built like he'd carried heavy things his whole life. And she was 88 years old and barely 100 pounds. By every measure that makes sense, she should not have been able to move him an inch, but she got down in the snow beside him. She got her shoulder up under his arm, and she said, "On 3, you push with your legs, I'll do the rest. 1, 2. And somehow, between his ruined legs and her stubborn little frame, Duke came up out of that drift. He staggered. She braced him. Ranger circled their feet. And step by frozen step, the 3 of them crossed those 10 feet to the truck, which felt more like 10 miles, and she poured him into the passenger seat and slammed the door and hurried around and climbed up behind the wheel. The heater was already running. Warm air hit Duke's face, and he nearly wept from it. "My bike," he said. "I can't leave the bike." "Your bike'll keep," she said. "A frozen man won't. We'll send Hollies for it in the morning." She dropped the truck into gear. "Now what do they call you?" Duke Hargrove." "Eleanor Prentice," she said. "And that's Ranger, I heard. All right, Duke Hargrove, let's get you thawed out." She pulled back onto the highway, slow and steady, both hands on the wheel, peering over the dash through the storm. And Duke sat there with the dog shivering in his lap, and the heat crawling back into his bones, and he watched this tiny old woman drive them through a blizzard like it was a Sunday afternoon. He had to ask. It had been eating at him since she stepped out of that truck. "Ms. Prentice." Everybody else drove by, every single one. Why'd you stop?" She didn't answer right away. She just kept her eyes on the road. And then she said, quiet, "Because somebody has to, that's all. Somebody always has to." Duke let it go. He was too tired to push. He figured it was just something kind old ladies said. He had no idea yet how much that sentence would come to mean. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long dirt lane, a white two-story with a porch light burning against the dark. Eleanor got him inside, got him into a chair by the wood stove, and stripped the frozen gloves off his hands. She rubbed his fingers between her small, warm palms, slow and patient, working the blood back into them while he hissed at the pins and needles. She fed the dog a bowl of last night's stew. She put coffee in Duke's hands and a blanket over his shoulders. She didn't fuss. She just did the next thing and then the next, the way people do who have spent a lifetime taking care of somebody. And little by little, Duke came back to the land of the living. By the time the storm was howling full against the windows, he was warm and dry and full of the best beef stew he'd had in 20 years. Ranger was asleep on the rug with his paws twitching. The fire popped. Eleanor sat across from him in a rocking chair with her own cup of coffee, and for a long while neither of them said a word, and it was the good kind of quiet. Duke felt his shoulders come down from around his ears, for the first time in he didn't know how long. "I'll be out of your way at first light," he said. "Soon as I get my bike running. I owe you my life, ma'am, I mean that." Eleanor waved it off. "You'll leave when the road's clear and not a minute before. Get some rest, Mr. Hargrove." And Duke leaned his head back against the chair and closed his eyes and thought for the first time all day that everything was going to be all right. He had no idea what was about to happen, because that's when he saw the footlocker. His eyes had drifted open, lazy, half asleep, and they'd landed on the far corner of the room, where an old army footlocker sat under the window with a folded quilt on top of it. Dark green, metal corners. Stenciled letters faded down almost to nothing on the side. Duke had seen 10,000 of them in his life. He'd owned 3, and normally he wouldn't have looked twice, but the letters, even faded, even across a dim room, something about those letters caught in him like a hook. He sat up. "Ms. Prentice," he said slowly, "that footlocker, whose was that?" Eleanor followed his eyes. Something in her face changed, softened and closed up at the same time. "My husband's," she said. "Walter. He passed 11 years ago come spring. He served Vietnam, 2 tour." She said it flat, the way people say a thing they've carried so long it's worn smooth. "He was a medic, came home in '69 and was never quite the whole way home again, if you follow me." Duke's coffee cup had gone still in his hands. His heart was doing something strange in his chest. "Ms. Prentice," he said, and his voice had dropped low. "Would you tell me the rest of that name, the stencil? I can't read it from here." She looked at him a long moment. Then she got up, crossed the room, and lifted the quilt off the lid. The stencil read, WPRNTASS, and under it, smaller, 25THINF. And under that, a nickname somebody had painted by hand a long time ago, half chipped away but still there. "Doc." Duke stood up out of the chair so fast the blanket fell off his shoulders. For a second he couldn't get any words out at all. His ruined hands were shaking, and it wasn't the cold this time. He stared at that footlocker like it was a ghost that had walked in out of the storm. "Doc Prentice," he whispered, "25th Infantry." Eleanor went very still. "How," she said carefully, "would a man like you know my husband's army nickname?" Duke turned to look at her. "And I want you to picture this, because it's the whole reason I'm telling you this story. A big weathered biker, 68 years old, a man who hadn't cried since he was a boy, standing in a stranger's living room with his eyes filling up. Because he saved my life," Duke said. March of '68. A rice paddy outside Ku Kai. I was shot through the leg and pinned down in the mud, and I was bleeding out, and everybody with any sense stayed put because the fire was too heavy. He stopped. He had to breathe. And one skinny medic crawled 200 yards through open ground to get to me, packed the wound, threw me over his shoulder, carried me back, took a round in the arm doing it, and never even slowed down. The room had gone silent except for the fire. I never knew his real name, Duke said. We all just called him Doc. They shipped me stateside 2 days later, and I never saw him again. I spent 40 years trying to find him. 40 years, Ms. Prentice, to say thank you, to tell him I made something of the life he gave back to me. His voice broke clean in half. The name on that paper in my saddlebag, the promise I was riding to Montana to keep. It was his. I was coming to find Walter Prentice's family. I didn't even have an address. Just a town and a hope. Now, before I tell you what Alina did, I've got to say this. If a story about a stranded old biker and an 88-year-old widow is hitting you somewhere real right now, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who need them. All right, back to that living room, because it's about to get to the part that gets me every time. Alina Prentice stood there with the quilt in her hands and tears running down every one of those 88 years of lines on her face. And she didn't say anything grand. She just sat down slow on the edge of the footlocker, like her legs had quit on her, and pressed one hand flat against the lid. He talked about you, she said. Duke's knees nearly gave. What? Not you by name. He never knew your name either, but there was a boy. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. For 40 years, once or twice a year, usually in the bad nights, Walter would sit right where you're standing and he'd say, I wonder if that boy from the paddy made it. I wonder what he did with it. It ate at him, not knowing. He carried a lot of men who didn't make it, Mr. Hargrove. You were the one he could never stop wondering about, the one he hoped for. Duke put his hand over his mouth. 40 years, both of them wandering across half a country, each carrying the other like a stone in the chest. He made it, Alina said, looking up at him, and now she was almost laughing through the tears. Look at you. He'd want to know. He'd want to know so bad. That boy made it. Duke crossed the room and got down on his knees in front of that little woman, this huge man folding down onto the floor. And he took her small hands in his ruined ones, as gentle as if they were made of glass. Tell me about him, he said. Tell me everything, please. I've got the rest of my life and I want to hear all of it. So she did. Right there on the floor by the fire, with the storm hammering the windows and the dog awake now and pressing his head against Duke's knee, Alina Prentice told him about Walter. She told him how Walt came home in '69 to a country that spit on soldiers, and how he never once got the welcome he'd earned. How he took a job at the feed store and never talked about the war to anybody but her, in the dark, on the nights the dreams came. How he'd flinch at fireworks every 4th of July for 40 years. How the town, the same town whose sons and husbands he'd probably have crawled through fire to save too, mostly just saw a quiet, damaged man they'd rather not think about. They looked right through him, she said. His whole life. The way those trucks looked right through you today, like he wasn't worth the stopping. And there it was, the thing Duke had asked her in the truck, why she stopped. After Walter passed, Alina said, I made myself a promise. I decided I would never once drive past a person in trouble on that road. Not ever. Not if they scared me, not if they looked rough, not if it was inconvenient, not if it was a blizzard and I was an old woman with no business being out. She squeezed his hands. Because everybody drove past my Walter his whole life, and I could not stand the thought of doing to another human soul what this world did to him. Duke bowed his head. "You've stopped for people before," he said. "It wasn't a question." 41 of them, Eleanor said. "I keep count, in a little notebook. Stranded folks, mostly. A few hitchhikers my daughter says'll be the death of me. A young mother with a flat and 2 babies in car seats. You're number 41, Mr. Hargrove." She almost smiled. "I never once had a single reason to think any of them was special. I just stopped because somebody has to." "And number 41," Duke said quietly, "turned out to be the boy your husband spent 40 years praying made it home." Eleanor's face crumpled at that, and she pressed her forehead down against their joined hands, and the two of them stayed like that a long time, an old widow and an old soldier, both of them shaking, while the fire burned down low. Then she lifted her head and wiped her face and said the thing that finished it. "You know what this means, don't you?" she said. "It means Walter did get his answer. He just had to send me out into a blizzard 11 years after he was gone to get it. That stubborn man." She let out a wet laugh. "He never could leave a thing unfinished." Duke reached over and lifted the lid of the footlocker. He didn't ask permission. Somehow he knew he didn't need to, and Eleanor didn't stop him. Inside was a life. A folded uniform gone soft with age, a purple heart in a small box, letters tied with string, and on top in a cheap dime store frame a photograph, black and white, curled at the edges. A dozen young men in a row, shirtless, sunburned, grinning at a camera in a country on the other side of the world. Duke's finger came down on one of them. A skinny kid, second from the left, with a medic's bag over his shoulder and a grin like he owned the whole rotten war. "That's him," Duke breathed. "That's Doc, my God, he was just a kid. We were all just kids." Then his finger slid 3 men over. To a tall young soldier at the end of the row with a bandage still on his leg, leaning on a rifle, looking half dead and half glad to be alive. "And that," Duke said, and his voice failed him completely, "that's me, 2 days after he carried me out. Somebody took this before they flew me home." He looked up at Eleanor, stunned. "We're in the same photograph. He kept it. For 40 years. Your husband kept a picture of the boy he saved, and he never even knew it." Eleanor took the frame in both hands and held it up close to her old eyes and looked at the 2 young men, 3 feet apart in the sunshine of 1968, both of them still alive, neither of them knowing the storm that would bring them back together half a century later in a farmhouse in Montana. "He'd have loved to see this day," she whispered. "He'd have loved it more than anything." The storm blew itself out sometime before dawn. Duke didn't sleep that night, and neither did Eleanor. They sat up till the fire was embers, and she made a fresh pot of coffee around 3 in the morning, and Duke told her every single thing he could remember about the man she'd loved. The way Doc had talked, the jokes he'd made, the way he'd sung under his breath while he worked, some old country song, and Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth and said, "Hank Williams. That was his favorite. Lord, he sang it in the shower for 40 years. And they both laughed until they were crying again, because that's how grief and joy work when they finally get in the same room. When the sun came up, it came up clean and blinding off a world buried in white. And a man named Hollies, Eleanor's neighbor down the road, came by in a plow truck like she'd known he would, and the 2 men drove out to the highway and hauled Duke's frozen Harley back to the barn on a trailer. It took Duke 3 days to get the bike running. Water in the fuel line, just like he'd figured. But here's the thing. He wasn't in any hurry anymore. Every morning he'd come in from the barn with grease on his ruined hands, and Eleanor would have breakfast on the table, and Ranger would be curled up by the stove like he'd lived there his whole life. And Duke started to notice all the things a farm needs from a man that an 88-year-old woman can't do alone. A gate off its hinge. A porch step gone soft. A woodpile getting low with a whole winter still to come. On the 4th morning, over eggs, Alina set down her fork and said, "Duke, where were you headed exactly, after you kept your promise?" Duke thought about it, really thought about it, and the honest answer surprised him. "Nowhere," he said. "I got no wife. She passed 6 years back. No kids. I sold the house. That flag and that name in my saddlebag was the last thing I had left to do." He looked down at his coffee. "After that, I figured I'd just ride till I ran out of road." Alina nodded slowly. Then she said, in that same plain way she said everything, "That barn's got a room over it. Walter fixed it up for hired hands years ago. Good stove, own door." She picked her fork back up. "It's just sitting there. Seems a waste, an empty room and a man with nowhere to be." Duke didn't answer right away. He couldn't. His throat had closed up. "I'd earn my keep," he finally said. "I don't take charity." "I know you don't," Alina said. "Neither did Walter, that's rather the point." And that was that. No big speech, no fuss. Just two lonely people deciding, over breakfast, not to be lonely anymore. Duke Hargrove never did run out of road. He put down roots instead, in the last place he ever expected, at the end of a dirt lane outside Bozeman. He fixed every broken thing on that farm and then found more to fix. He drove Alina to church on Sundays and to her doctor in town and to the graveyard on the hill where Walter was buried. And the first time he stood at that stone, Duke took off his hat and got down on one knee and said out loud at last, the thank you he'd been carrying for 40 years. Alina stood back and let him have that. It was his to say and Walter's to hear. Ranger, that half-wild stray that nobody at the gas station wanted, grew fat and slept on the foot of Alina's bed and lived like a king for the rest of his days. And that little notebook of Alina's kept filling up. Because now, on the bad weather days, it was Duke who took the truck out to the highway and drove it slow, watching the shoulder. Number 42 was a trucker with a busted radiator. Number 43 was a teenager who'd slid into a ditch and was too scared to call his folks. Duke stopped for every one of them. He'd load them in the cab and say the same thing Alina had said to him, more or less. Somebody has to. And then he'd bring them home to a warm stove and a bowl of stew, and Alina would fuss over them, and they'd drive off the next morning not quite believing what had happened to them. Alina Prentice lived to be 94. She had 6 good years with Duke and the dog in that farmhouse. 6 years, she always said, were a gift she never expected, an unearned bit of grace at the tail end of a long life. When she passed, it was in her sleep in the spring with Duke in the room over the barn and Ranger's son on the rug. She left him the farm, every acre of it, and the footlocker, and I'll leave you with this. That first night, out on the highway, a whole world of trucks drove past a freezing old man they decided wasn't worth the trouble. Big rigs, warm cabs, people who could have saved him with a phone call and chose not to look. And the only soul who stopped was the one person out there who had the least to give, an 88-year-old widow, barely 5 feet tall, in a rusted-out truck, driving through a blizzard she had no business being out in. She stopped because a long time ago the world drove past a man she loved, over and over, and it broke something in her that never healed. And she decided she'd spend whatever years she had left being the person she wished had stopped for him. She never knew, when she pulled over, that the frozen stranger in the snow was the very boy her husband had crawled through fire to save. She couldn't have known. She just stopped because somebody has to. But I think Walter knew. I think somewhere, somehow, that stubborn old medic who couldn't stand to leave a thing unfinished sent his wife out into the storm to bring home the last man he ever saved. 2 soldiers, 3 feet apart in a photograph from 1968. Half a century, half a country, and a blizzard between them. And in the end, they both made it home.